Hello.
Hey, we still have 2 attendees in here.
Oh, the attendees is fine. Attendees
Okay.
are the people that are coming to watch the panel.
Right, I just wasn't sure. When I logged in, I went to a waiting room first, so I just want to make sure that's okay. So will it function like normal Zoom where I get a pop-up that somebody's in a waiting room?
There are no waiting rooms, so attendees just click. You just promoted me to panelists so I could actually talk to you, because if I was an attendee, I wouldn't be able to say anything.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yes, okay. Perfect. And then as the speakers come in, I have it up on a screen. So you are doing COVID-19 issues. So as these people come in, just promote them to panelists.
You don't have to, actually, it depends.
Okay. Oh, that's right, because we got a personalized link. So if they don't use the personalized link.
Yes. So you can keep an eye on the schedule.
Okay. And then when you handle the Q&A and somebody's an attendee, you have to push allow them to talk. Okay. Promote to panel. How do you handle the share screen with a panelist? Do they have the ability to do that themselves?
Panelists can share their screen, so it's not a problem.
Okay. Perfect. And I see Scott has just come in.
Yes, so Scott can easily share his screen. So anybody who's a panelist can share their screen.
Okay. I'm not seeing Scott attached to a presentation. Hi, Scott. When you get a chance, will you let us know what presentation you're attached to? It might just be missing in the program.
I mean, it could be that Scott just presented, and when he clicked on the link.
Oh, gotcha.
So I don't see him here, and so it's just one of those things where.
Okay.
And I don't think his mic is working either. So.
Okay.
Here's what you can do. You can. I suggest that maybe you can place Scott as an attendee.
Okay.
So you can click on his name and put, remove, and he can come back as an attendee. I don't know if you can demote.
Change role to attendee. Okay. So he's an attendee now.
Yeah. So that if he I just want to make sure that we're careful with people attending and make sure that there aren't any.
Right. Yes. So I just want to, that's kind of where I'm going, like manage any issues that come up. So change role to attendee. What is put on hold?
That I don't know. So I'm just not messing with it.
And then remove is just flat out remove, kick them from.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So when, so I really don't need to do, panelists can share.
Yes.
What were you doing with promoting to host? Do I need to do anything about that?
No, I'm not. Okay. You don't need to do anything. So the panelists, unless you can promote people to panelists. Mm-hmm. Let's see.
I just want to make sure and head off any problems for you. You know, I would hate to do something incorrect. You know what I mean? and cause some issues for you.
You're awesome. It's fine. It's fine. So the only thing is when a Q&A question pops up.
Yep.
Okay. When a Q&A question pops up, you have to click on answer live, or else the panelists nor the panelists nor the attendees can see the questions. So you want to make sure that you're able to you can release the questions. Mm-hmm. And monitor the chat, just make sure there aren't any Zoom bombs or something. And
gotcha. Hi, Tabitha. Welcome. Let me activate my video. Hi. Joan is just running me through moderating the stream, so that's why we're chatting. But yeah, welcome to stream 3. And will you be remaining on the Zoom, Joan, or is your like faculty meeting like completely off? Like, will you be around?
I'll be. I mean, if you can always text me or just
Okay.
if you need help. I have my 1 o'clock is pretty informal, but my 2 o'clock isn't. So,
Okay.
but it's really, I promise, it's not just. So your panel has.
I'm all nervous about it. I'm like way more nervous than my synchronous classes.
Oh, you have four presenters.
Okay.
So keep it too close to the 10-minute, but don't silence anybody, because that's just poor form.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that, but
yeah,
I will watch time.
Yeah, so it's fine. It's fine. You're fine. Everybody's fine. It's a global pandemic.
Yeah.
We're all gonna die.
I know. Do you see? This is my 5-year-old, literally doing kindergarten.
Oh my gosh, Jackson,
he's gonna be dismissed here in a second. But yeah, speaking of global pandemic.
You know what? We all must do what we must do.
Yeah. Hi, Brenda. Welcome.
Hi. So is Ashley Blinkhorn here?
No.
Okay. So she's the one that's supposed to be presenting our research.
There's time. I'm gonna jet out because I have a faculty meeting.
Okay.
And Jordana kindly agreed to replace me because I had a last minute.
Great.
One of those things.
Okay, well, hopefully she'll show up here in a minute.
Yes. So Jordana, my suggestion for Brenda's is Ashley, you're a grad student?
No, she's not my grad student. She's a grad student at another institution. Okay. But I don't even have the slides. I'm not prepared to present because she was handling it. I just came to support her. So hopefully she'll show up to present.
Yes. So if she happens, Jordana, you just monitor, you don't have to go in order, so it's not a big deal, but just monitor the attendee list, because there might be something, Ashley might accidentally enter as an attendee where you might have to promote her to a panelist.
Yeah, speaking of, I'm looking at the attendee list right now just to make sure we don't have any crossover.
I guess all I'll say is if she doesn't show up, then don't call on me to present because I don't actually have the presentation. She was taking the lead on this. So.
Well, one of the things, there's no reason why you'd have to go in order, Jordana. Okay. So it's you're fine.
Oh, there's Sarah, who's also on our team. Sarah, would you be able to step in and present if Ashley doesn't attend? She's not here yet.
Sarah?
Hi.
Sarah? Oh. Hi. Hey, in the event that Ashley doesn't show up here in a minute, would you be able to present?
Yeah, I can. I just talked to her. She's on her way.
Okay.
Yeah, it's no biggie. And okay. You have full control. My suggestion, I've been doing this, is you can also change your name, like Jordana Stream 3, so that you actually put a name to the face. And one thing I like to do is when people are presenting, I switch off my camera because you don't know what's going to happen when you're not presenting. You don't need any tubing.
Yesterday.
Hey, Ashley.
Look at Sarah laughing.
We can be on a Zoom together.
Bye, guys. Have a great time. Have fun.
Bye.
And I'm sure you guys are going to be awesomely wonderful. Take care.
Bye.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Ellen. Hello.
Hello.
So I don't know how you've been doing this, but I was assuming that where one co-author is presenting and the others aren't, that we would just turn our cameras off while she's presenting and turn them back on for questions, or?
Oh, it's whatever you're comfortable with. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't mind your head floating near me, or you can just show people your name. I don't care.
We can just sit here and nod thoughtfully.
Yeah.
Hey, Manish.
Hey guys, hey all. Hey Ashley.
So is the paper order acceptable for everybody?
I think it makes sense because people know what to expect.
Okay, all right. So we will start here in just a minute. Just to the attendees in the room, if you should be a panelist, can you alert me to that? And I'm scanning the list and I will promote you. Okay, so it's 1 o'clock. Welcome to CrimCon Stream 3. I am not Joan Atunas. My name is Jordana Navarro. I am covering for Joan, who had to run to a faculty meeting, so welcome. I'm going to give as much time to the presentations, which are the important piece, as possible, so we'll go ahead and get started right away. If you need anything, there should be a chat box at the bottom to send a chat through or an anonymous question. We're going to hold questions till the end per a normally scheduled conference. And with that, we are going to open with Ashley, who will be presenting the first paper, and I'll let her introduce that topic and the presenters.
Hey everyone, I'm going to share my screen and we will get this started. My name is Ashley Blinkhorn. I'm a grad student at the University of Colorado-Boulder. And this morning, or today, we are presenting a paper called COVID-19 Pandemic, Authoritarianism, Political Beliefs, and Legitimacy of Government Restrictions. This was definitely a team effort. I deserve almost no credit. My team is amazing. Dr. Sarah Daly, Dr. Manish Madan, and Dr. Brenda Rowe were all wonderful, and we've learned a lot. So let's get started. Our research questions were, who do respondents view as most responsible for addressing this pandemic? We're all living through it, but who do folks consider responsible? How does the pandemic affect legitimacy of those responsible? What other factors can predict legitimacy? And what factors predict safe behavior during the pandemic? In terms of methodology, we used an online survey that we shared internationally via personal and professional social networks. We used official press releases from several universities. We placed ads on Facebook, links in Facebook groups, and we also included links in the comment sections of online news sources. You have not lived till you've read the comment section in your local newspaper. In order to improve participation, we offered $10 Amazon gift cards that were available through a lottery system. And as Bernie Sanders here said, we once again were asking folks to do a survey. In terms of our sample, we ended up with 2,742 responses, but because our survey was long and a lot of people had an issue with survey fatigue, we decided to only include, for the sake of this paper, the 1,262 responses from the United States that had a 95% or more completion rate. Most respondents in our sample were white, female, Democrat, had a bachelor's degree or higher, and lived in urban or suburban areas. Our age range was very wide. We had people all the way from 18 years old to 85 years old with a mean age of 23.87. In terms of descriptive statistics, now I'm going to talk and apologize up front for the vast number of tables that we're going to share today. We have a lot to go over. So as far as legitimacy is concerned, that was our measure for who the respondent felt was most responsible when dealing with the pandemic. We also had questions about their fear of COVID. We had questions that looked at perceptions of the federal government's response, perceptions of the state government response. We included an authoritarianism scale that had already been verified through other research. We also asked people to discuss their change in federal trust on a 1 to 5 scale. How much do they trust the federal government before COVID-19? And then how much did they trust the government by June or July when they took this survey? We also asked the same question of people in terms of their state governments. How much did you trust your state government a year ago? And how much do you trust your state government now in the midst of a pandemic? In terms of the last variable here, we also asked people about safe behaviors they were engaging in because of COVID-19. So this includes things like extra hand washing, wearing a face mask, staying home, always observing social distancing. And all of our variables here were legitimized. They were ran through and they've all got a very high Chromebox alpha. So we're in good shape. In terms of our results, here's our first results table, yay. We compared mean legitimacy scores. So essentially this table is looking at who the respondent considers to be most responsible and how responsible they find that person or entity to be. So the mean responsibility factor for the president turned out to be 30.72, but we found that people tend to trust their governor and their local leaders quite a lot. They came in at the top of this ranking here with a rating of 72.81 and 72.28. The federal government also scored very low with a 35.86. Next thing was we ran through and ran a model to predict perceptions of federal government response. And what we found was that if people trusted, if people ranked highly on authoritarianism, they also significantly perceived that the federal government was doing a great job. And if they had a high fear of COVID, that was significant. Political ideology was significant, and change in federal trust was also significant. We also ran this model and looked at using age and race. So while race was not significant, age was. We also looked at predicting legitimacy of authority when addressing the pandemic. So we looked at how people assessed the, I lost my words. We looked at how people assessed the legitimacy of their authority in addressing the pandemic, and we found that essentially people felt that the president and the federal government, the governor, the constants are all significant, but really what we found is that the political ideology and fear of COVID seems to impact how people view the legitimacy of the authority figures. And also a change in federal trust was significant in impacting the view of the president. Predicting safe behaviors, we show that if you found the president to be legitimate, that was significant in addition to fear of COVID. Fear of COVID is a very strong signifier and unifier through all of our models. If people had a fear of COVID, they tended to take it seriously, which is what we need, especially right now. If people found the federal government to be the most responsible, then they found significant we could predict their safe behaviors based on political ideology and fear of COVID. And if you found the governor to be most responsible, then fear of COVID and general legitimacy of this variable would also impact and predict safe behavior. Now, looking at this is also interesting because we didn't find age was significant, but race was significant in this model, both for people who looked at the president as the most legitimate, and then predicting their safe behaviors was found to be significant, but also people who believed in the federal government, race was found to be a significant variable. So in terms of discussion, there are obvious differences in political parties and attitudes about the president. I think we can all agree on that. Increased support and more positive attitudes about governors were found. So it seems that people trust their governor and their local level government far more than they trust their president, which was very interesting. We also found consistent support for fear of COVID as a predictive variable, particularly for legitimacy and safe behaviors. Our policy implications and future research suggestions include that we continue to highlight the work of scientists and address individual concerns about the seriousness of COVID. As long as we continue to repeat how serious COVID is, it seems that that actually gets through to people and helps impact their behaviors. We also found that political ideology influenced legitimacy and who folks found responsible, which also impacted safe behaviors. We're also very interested in the future to examine change in safe behaviors, legitimacy, and more after the transition to President-elect Biden. So it would be lovely to do a future study and take a look at that. Here is our contact information. Again, my name is Ashley Blinkhorn. I'm a grad student at University of Colorado-Boulder. My amazing team was composed of Brenda, Rowe, Manish, Madan, Sarah, Daly. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashley. If you have any questions for Ashley, we would ask that you drop it in the chat box just to make sure everybody will get a chance to present their papers. There's only 4 papers in this session, so we can go a little bit above the 10 minutes. And what I'll do for the next paper is, I don't want to interrupt people, but if you're going above the 10 minutes, I'll signal 2 and then 1 and then 0. But yes, that was great. Thank you. So if you have questions, please send questions to the chat box and I will go back to muting myself for the next paper. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question that says, are your numbers in percentages? I'm not exactly certain which numbers you mean. I would guess that you're asking about the descriptive statistics, maybe? If you could drop more information in the chat box, I'd be happy to answer your question.
Yes, if we could swing back to that question after all papers are presented, that way we're sure we get to everybody. And Ashley, that'll give you time, Ashley, to review it. I'd like to then ask Ellen or whoever is presenting a legal socialization model, that paper, to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Okay, I'm ready to go. Let me share my screen.
Wonderful, thank you.
I may take some of the extra time. Let's see.
Okay, so if you could just watch your chat, I'll turn on my video and I'll just signal 2, 1, 0. But yes, go ahead.
Good. Let me get it back. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to.
You're completely fine.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to start. There is actually a lot of overlap with the first paper and our paper, where we do work on legal socialization, and we were trying to see if comparing our models to COVID following and COVID rule violating would be similar. Just to give you a little background, this has been sponsored by a grant from the National Science Foundation with my collaborators, Cesar Rebillon, Karen Van Gundy, and some of the people who have worked on the project are some current and former students. And just to give you an outline, basically, you've heard this from the previous talk, that COVID-19 rules have been advocated by public health and government officials. And we wanted to test whether our legal socialization models that we've used with legal or illegal kinds of rule violating behavior. We're going to present 2 models. One of them overlaps the procedural justice model with the previous paper. And we're going to give findings for what we found for the integrated cognitive legal socialization model and the procedural justice model, and future research and conclusions. There are gaps in the legal socialization literature because, as I said, they're predicting violating legal rules, not non-legal rules, such as public health recommendations that relate to COVID-19. All of the research has only looked at predicting rule violating behavior. In our study, we also look at rule following behavior. And most of the research, with the exception of probably our lab, has mostly focused on legal officials such as police, and they definitely, all of us have ignored public health officials. So the cognitive legal socialization model tries to explain how people develop understandings of the rules, but mostly it's, as I said, it's looked at legal rules and the decision to violate them. And we've looked at extra legal sources in our research with adolescents. We've looked at parents and teachers. That work is influenced by moral reasoning behavior. We look at everyday legal reasoning, which is likelihood of reporting somebody who violates rules to authority figures. We also look at normative status, how much you approve of rule violating, and enforcement status. And in this study, we also looked at approval of following rules. So the typical legal socialization model, the traditional model, looks at how legal attitudes, approval of behavior, approval of punishment, basically mediate between legal reasoning and rule violating behavior. And the procedural justice model, some of this has been said before, looks at procedures that you enforce a rule that's perceived as fair, with the components being voice and impartiality. And believing, we just talked about legitimacy of authority in the previous talk, believing that an authority figure is appropriate, proper, and just, including trust and obligation to obey. So the more legitimacy, the less people will violate rules. And then also legal cynicism, which we actually didn't look at in this study. This is the traditional procedural justice model, with legitimacy and legal cynicism mediating between procedural justice and rule violating behavior. Now, in the current study, we administered our surveys to 290 adults, 19 to 29, who are part of our 10-wave New Hampshire youth study. So we have our oldest cohort is now 28 to 29, and they were 14 when we started our study. We have our 24 to 25-year-old cohort who were in 6th grade or 11 in 2006. And then our youngest cohort who are now 19 to 20, and they were in only 3 of our waves starting when they were in 6th grade or age 11. And we asked them questions about rule following and rule violating COVID behaviors. And we asked them questions from the cognitive legal socialization model and also the procedural justice model. Let's see. So just to give you an idea of the measures, we use the everyday legal reasoning scale. Just shows you some of the items. Everyday moral reasoning. We looked at what we call normative status, or how much they approved of the behaviors, and we asked them about rule violating and rule following. And we asked them how much they approved of basically punishing people who engaged in those behaviors. We measured procedural justice. We measured how fairly people feel treated. We measured legitimacy, which was talked about in the last paper. We also looked at these rule violating behaviors, and we used a variety measure. How many of the behaviors you engaged in? So we did a Qualtrics survey, and it went out to all of our respondents. And I wanted to be able to get to all the data. So the first thing we wanted to do was see if our model could predict rule violating behavior, which is the typical kind of way it works. And what we found, interestingly, is legal reasoning was not related to people violating COVID rules. Moral reasoning was much more important. So approval of rule violating behavior and approval of punishing people who violated it both predicted COVID-19, but also approval of punishment mediated between moral reasoning and rule violating behavior, which is really different than what we found with our illegal kinds of behaviors. Then we looked at rule following, which no one has really predicted rule following before. And here, interestingly, both moral reasoning directly predicted rule following behavior, but also approval of rule following behavior and approval of, that should not have been in there. I'm not sure why that was, we looked at that, but that actually should probably not be in the model. And what we found is that approval of rule following behavior did mediate between legal reasoning and rule following, and moral reasoning directly related. We looked at this question of legitimacy, which again was talked about in the previous paper. We asked about not just public health officials, but we asked about national, federal officials. We asked about state officials, which was mentioned in the previous presentations. But I wanted to show the data for public health officials. We asked people about public health officials like Dr. Fauci. And what we found in doing that is that it's kind of interesting. Like, I have the arrow going to the left, but it's almost like the opposite of the procedural justice model. It almost seems like legitimacy, trusting public health officials, leads one to feel that they're treated fairly by public health officials. And then people are less likely to violate COVID rules. So it's almost the inverse of the procedural justice model, which usually says procedural justice comes first. And in fact, in this model, it almost looks like legitimacy comes first. We also looked at rule following, and in this model, again, it seems like the same trend, that legitimacy, I have the arrow going the opposite way, but really it seems like legitimacy leads to procedural justice, which then leads to rule following, which I think is really interesting, very different than the legal kinds of behaviors. We haven't looked, and rule following, by the way, has never really been looked at. And then we looked at police officers to see what would happen there. And interesting, when it comes to rule violating behavior, it looks like the typical procedural justice model when it comes to police. So the more you feel treated fairly by police, the more legitimate, the more you can trust them and feel an obligation to them, and the less likely you are to violate COVID rules. When it comes to rule following, police don't have anything to do with that, people following rules. There's a connection between procedural justice and legitimacy, but it really doesn't have anything to do with rule following, which I think is interesting. So what are the findings, the implications? I think that it really has a lot to say about how we think about COVID regulations, requirements. It's clearly the fact that morality seems to have more of an impact on how people think about breaking COVID rules rather than legality. It also seems that legitimacy of certain authorities, particularly public health authorities, seems to lead to how much procedural justice we have for them, and then how likely we are to violate or follow the COVID rules. So the implications for literature are that we need to expand to think about other outcomes than just legal outcomes, because when it comes to COVID, we're not really talking about laws. I mean, states are now mandating mask wearing, but there's a penalty for that. It's not a serious crime that people are engaging in. And so I think people's likelihood to follow the rules of COVID are more because of what they think is morally right. One of the things we found in our study is that the most important reason that people violate COVID rules are because they want to see their families. But the number one reason they follow them is they don't want to get their family sick, which I think is an interesting contradiction. In the future, we're hoping to try to replicate these findings. And we're also looking at the role of emotion, where in this study, we've found some impact of anxiety on whether people follow or don't follow rules, with people who are highly anxious being more likely to follow the rules than people who are not anxious. And so I think there are a lot of implications for this study.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Again, if you have any questions, please utilize the chat box. There's a question box, and we will let the next presenter come to the virtual floor. Is there anybody presenting with Thomas? Okay. Tabitha, could we just switch in this for the sake of time? Maybe he ran into something. Okay,
Absolutely.
great. Thank you. Thank you for being flexible.
No problem. Well, nyata everyone. Nyata wan nyatu nyaklion purin minyan nyatu kundichmara. Mea pawanga nyuntu wanyu pumil ala mingana miring. Tinwernye yana popa miring. Unyata, my name is Tabitha, or as my ancestors know me, Purin Minyan. I am a Gunditjmara woman indigenous to this country they now call Australia. And I'm zooming in today from the unceded lands of the Kaurna people, and I pay my respects to their elders and thank the Kaurna people for their ongoing custodianship of this country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I would also like to acknowledge any sovereign lands that you stand on today, as well as any fellow Indigenous people presenting or attending this conference. I am a criminalised Black woman, having spent 2 years in prison and an accumulative 2 years on home detention. I am still tethered to the system on parole, or as I like to call it, open air prison. I am number 157057. I've made mistakes in my past, and some of them were despicable. My face was flashed across the TV and newspapers. My life became a magazine anyone could thumb through. The reason I'm telling you this is not to offer myself up for your judgment, but because I know how people like their information packaged in bundles of objectivity. Today, though, this presentation is completely cloaked in subjectivity, or as Aboriginal scholar Tyson Yunkaporta calls it, a filthy reality of belongingness, because I am bringing every ounce of my lived experience as a criminalised Black woman to this place. I want to let you know it's extremely early here in Australia, and I don't have any slides, so you'll just be seeing me today. I am one of this country's disposable people. I am a criminalised Indigenous woman in a colonial settler state, violently founded upon policies and practices designed to erase, eradicate, breed out, extinguish, deny, and invisibilise my kind. Every breath I draw is an act of radical resistance. Now, a lot has changed since I submitted this paper. When I submitted the abstract, I did so against a backdrop of perpetual and enduring mourning in our community. 19-year-old Walkeri man, Kumajay Walker, had just been brutally murdered in his hometown by a police officer, and we took to the streets in solidarity with the family and to express our grief very publicly over his death, and in protest of the violence police perpetrate in our communities. Gatherings were held across this country, and here at Parliament House, on unceded Kaurna land, people stood with red painted hands and listened to family members and demanded answers, truth and justice. So at this stage, we had recorded more than 400 deaths in custody since 1991, and our grandmothers, mothers and aunties were grieving the loss of their sons and daughters to every kind of colonial frontier that exists in this country. It was a time of Black rage, Black grief and perpetual sadness, 232 years of rage and grief, in fact, because we have lived in a state of perpetual torment since white man first stepped on our shores. And then our mother delivered onto us a virus we could barely contain. We watched as she made her home in the throats of many, squeezing and strangling the life from us as you have done to her. She started to flick people off like fleas from a mongrel dog's back, and as the city slowed, the planes were grounded and the borders closed. We watched on as the Prime Minister, who believes in the second coming, raised his hand to his Creator, stood with his brethren, and proselytized the power of thoughts and prayers as a solution to man-made evil. And while we stayed in our homes and washed our hands and worried about where we'd find the next roll of toilet paper, George Floyd Jr. was murdered on the streets of Minneapolis. And from our own lounge rooms, we watched a world erupt. We watched our Black brothers and sisters in America rise up and demand justice. We watched them pump their fists in the air and scream, Black Lives Matter. We watched them take to the streets as one of their own had muttered the words, I can't breathe, as a police officer and agent of so-called justice and community safety extinguished a Black man's last breath by crushing his windpipe with his knee. He uttered the same words that our own David Dungay and Dungutty man, killed in custody in Long Bay Jail in 2015, uttered 20 times before his death. And then what we saw was a ricochet effect across the world, which even rippled across the shores to this island continent they call Australia. We saw white people here rise up and say, yep, it's not okay because Black Lives Matter. And we paused and did a double take and thought to ourselves, which Black lives? Because we weren't ever sure that our Black lives or Black bodies ever mattered unless in service or sacrifice to the colony. But even amid the confusion, the hypocrisy of people here holding another country to account for the same sins committed on these soils in the name of justice, good order, safety and morality, we saw an opportunity. This was a crucible moment. This was an opportunity for revolutionary transformation and we seized on it. And no, we didn't create a movement. We just had the chance to elevate our ongoing resistance movement that was born in 1788. So please know that we are not new to this, but we are absolutely true to it. So with the groundswell of support for a moment, which was the culmination of a series of events, Black Lives Matter protests were planned here. It was looking staunch, people were fired up, people were excited that maybe the lives and deaths of 434 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people might just get the same enthusiasm and care that our overseas brother had. And just as the groundswell was about to bloom, the placards were painted, the protest shirts were brought out, the Prime Minister released this advice, actually this directive for the people of this country. Don't go. 2 tiny words directing people to remain home. And then he followed up by saying, let's find a better way and another way to express these sentiments. Now, we were in the middle of a pandemic, but we were also in the middle of a war that had been raging against our people on our own soils for more than 2 centuries. Now, at this time, we were statistically more likely to be killed by a cop than killed by COVID-19. And I won't go into all the brilliant and extraordinary health and safety measures Black organisers of these rallies instituted, because there were many and varied, from face masks and hand sanitizer to fully staffed legal services on call to protect people potentially harmed or targeted by the police who would be present at the rallies. But what I want to draw out here is the extraordinary hypocrisy of the Prime Minister using the COVID virus to silence Black voices, when only a week or so before there had been rallies protesting 5G technology and forced immunisation. We had a case whereby the organisers of Melbourne's Stop Black Deaths in Custody rallies were fined under the COVID provisions and threatened with reprisals. Yet those who organised the anti-lockdown rallies were not. A racially motivated fining system. And well, the story is now very public, so I don't have to go into detail the Supreme Court rulings about the illegality of the Black Lives protests and the subsequent overturning of those decisions. But what I want to draw attention to is the over surveillance and silencing of Black voices in this country. I mean, it's everywhere. It's so visible, yet seems invisible to the colonizer. One of the biggest unexplored stories in this country over the past decade is the massive expansion of state surveillance and ultimately widespread breaches of our civil liberties. These tactics of intimidation, social control, and harassment have very real consequences. And in the case of COVID-19, this is not the first time that illness has been weaponised against Aboriginal people. Policing has always criminalised racialised people in public and in groups. It's just that with the pandemic, they were explicitly licensed to do so. In fact, I would argue the police have well and truly stepped into the realm of dark policing, where people are placed under extensive levels of surveillance without ever having committed a crime. But the thing is that the pandemic is just an excuse. This style of surveillance and policing is an everyday norm for Aboriginal people in our country. There are records of our children as young as 9 years old being placed under police surveillance. And we have always seen the deployment of the old narrative that uses a false ideal of peaceful protest to justify the use of excessive force against protesters in the name of maintaining the good order and safety of the community. The colonial state's co-option of peaceful protest as a tired tactic continues to be used to divide our movements for collective liberation. So far, in response to the recent uprisings in defence of Black Lives Matter here, we've seen the use of pepper spray on protesters, fining and arrests. In fact, the officer involved in the pepper spray incident in New South Wales was placed on light duties pending an internal investigation. And when asked about the event, the Premier of that state said we still have a long way to go, while the New South Wales Police Commissioner excused the officer by offering he had a bad day. This, of course, is egregious at all times, but even more so when Aboriginal people in this country are standing up and fighting for their lives in a colony committed to the oppression, subjugation and erasure of Black existence. So-called Australia is a colony that creates disposable humans, and it should be absolutely no surprise who the bulk of those disposable humans are: Indigenous people. Indigenous people who exist, resist, persist in surviving despite the best efforts of colonisation. Whether we are fighting for our Black lives to matter, breathing in front of a pot, we risk our life and our liberty. So when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean all Black lives, every single one of them. We mean the Black lives behind bars, the Black lives in schools, the Black lives being stolen from families and placed in out-of-home so-called care, the Black lives sitting in police cells, the Black lives in all of our communities. Because this is not a movement for innocence, this is a movement for humanity. And people don't get to decide which Black lives in Australia mattered. So if people in so-called Australia are standing with us in memory of George Floyd Jr., they need to stand in memory of every one of the now 445 Aboriginal people who have died in custody since 1991. You need to stand with us and beside us and for the long haul, because half measures are killing us.
Thank you. Let me just do a scan for Thomas. Has Thomas entered the room as an attendee? Okay. All right. Well, we will move on to the portion for Q&A. So, Ashley, would you like to swing back to that question that you began answering? You're muted. Wouldn't be 2020 if, you know.
Online conference be without me doing something silly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me pull up our slides again.
Okay.
So in terms of our descriptive statistics here, we are not using percentages. I had notes. We were using frequencies, and these are the mean scores over here all the way to the left column.
We can't see.
Can you see them?
You need to share your screen.
Oh, I am a mess today, y'all.
You're fine. And Tabitha, while she's doing that, oh, I apologize. While she's doing that, you have a question on deck.
Yes, there we go. Now y'all can see. Okay, so right here we can see the descriptive statistics, and actually we're showing the minimum score in the second column, the maximum score, Chromebooks Alpha. And over here, we weren't using percentages, we were using means. And essentially all of our categories over here were scales, including multiple questions, and typically they were 5-point Likert scales. So folks could achieve a minimum of a certain number and a maximum of a certain number. Does that help explain the question? Does anyone else on my team want to jump in?
I just want to ask a question of you on your table. How did you measure safe behavior? Is that a variety measure, or is that what does that measure? What does that number represent?
If I recall correctly, safe behavior was a set of behaviors that we asked folks if they participated in, I want to say on a 5-point scale from never to always. And it was rule following behavior as you chose to describe it. So it was safe behaviors like I stay inside as much as possible. I always wear a mask. I participate in social distancing, and we let people rank their own agreement with statements like that.
So it wasn't a variety measure like we use? No, right?
No.
Okay, thank you. Tabitha, would you like to answer the question for you in the chat box? And then if there are any additional questions, please, again, go ahead and ask. Go ahead.
Sure. So the question was whether the COVID-19 public health measures were specifically created to target Indigenous people in this country. And while they weren't specifically designed to target Indigenous people here, what we have in this country they call Australia is an over-policing of Indigenous people. So it's the way those laws were and those regulations were wielded and weaponised against Aboriginal people, specifically used to try and limit our capacity to protest and participate in the Black Lives Matter movement. So while they were applying to everyone, that is not how it played out here in this country. And as I mentioned, we had protests against the 5G implementation and forced immunisations, and no one was arrested or fined for breaching the COVID-19 measures. But as soon as Aboriginal people rose up and planned the Black Lives Matter protests here, in protest of the police lynching of our own people on the streets and in their homes, as well as killing people in custody, people were fined, arrested, pepper sprayed. So it was just the way those rules were applied that disproportionately affected us, but it was absolutely targeting us and attempting to silence and erase our voices in this space.
Okay, thank you. It appears you answered their question. Are there any other additional questions that have come in for our panelists? I'll give people a moment to type. Okay. Seeing none, in the absence of that paper, we're going to conclude a little earlier. So again, thank you to all the panelists sharing your wonderful work on a very timely topic. And thank you for coming despite the great time difference, you know, insightful work. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Have a great holiday. Take care.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You did awesome, Ashley.
Thank you.